The sun barely crept over the manicured lawns of Crestwood Estates, a gated community where every blade of grass adhered to the Homeowners Association's strict guidelines. The neighborhood gleamed with uniformity, identical beige stucco homes, white picket fences, and rose bushes trimmed to precisely 2.5 feet. But beneath the polished surface, Crestwood was a battlefield of egos, where power was measured in HOA board votes and social clout was currency. At the heart of this pristine enclave was Leonard "Len" Carter, the janitor. At 52, Len was a wiry man with calloused hands and a face etched with lines that told stories he never shared. His grey coveralls blended into the background as he swept the community center's marble floors, emptied trash cans filled with wine bottles from last night's HOA meeting, and scrubbed graffiti off the clubhouse walls, usually complaints about parking rules scrawled by rebellious teens. To the residents, Len was invisible, a ghost who kept their world spotless. They didn't know his last name, his history, or the fact that he listened to every whispered gossip and overheard every boardroom power play. Len had been at Crestwood for 15 years, hired by the property management company that ran the community's facilities. His job was simple: clean, fix, and stay out of sight. The HOA board, led by Margaret Hensley, a real estate mogul with a penchant for control, treated him like furniture. Margaret, with her platinum blonde bob and designer suits, barely glanced at Len as she barked orders about spotless sidewalks or perfectly polished brass fixtures. Her second-in-command, Roger Blaine, a retired banker with a perpetual scowl, once snapped at Len for leaving a mop bucket in view during an open house. "You're not paid to be seen," Roger had said, his voice dripping with disdain. The rest of the board wasn't much kinder. There was Sylvia Chen, a tech entrepreneur who saw Crestwood as her personal fiefdom, and Tom Whitaker, a lawyer who loved citing bylaws to assert dominance. They all ignored Len, except when they needed something fixed or cleaned. Even the residents, from the stay-at-home mums to the tech bros who'd bought into Crestwood's prestige, passed him without a nod. To them, he was just the janitor. But Len was more than that. He was a man with a past, a mechanical engineer who'd once designed cutting-edge machinery for a Fortune 500 company. A decade ago, a corporate scandal he had no part in had tanked his career. Blacklisted and broke, he'd taken the janitor job to survive, moving into a cramped apartment just outside Crestwood's gates. What no one knew was that Len had spent those years quietly rebuilding. He'd saved every penny, invested in stocks, and studied the market with the precision of a chess grandmaster. By night, in his dimly lit apartment, he pored over financial reports and coded algorithms to predict market trends. His bank account, hidden behind a nondescript name, was growing, fast. Len's invisibility was his superpower. He overheard everything: Margaret's plan to push through a new HOA fee hike, Roger's shady deal with a landscaping company, Sylvia's obsession with installing surveillance cameras to monitor rule breakers. He knew who cheated on their taxes, who was having an affair, and who was drowning in debt despite their Lexus in the driveway. Len didn't gossip or judge. He listened, stored the information, and kept sweeping. One morning, as Len polished the community center's chandelier, Margaret stormed in, her heels clicking like gunfire. "Leonard, the conference room is a mess," she snapped, not looking up from her phone. "Board meeting in an hour. Fix it." Len nodded, his face neutral, but he noticed the email on her screen. An offer to buy Crestwood's property management company, Pinnacle Properties, which controlled the community's operations. The offer was from a private equity firm, and the board was set to discuss it. Len filed the information away, his mind already calculating. That night in his apartment, Len pulled up Pinnacle's financials. The company was undervalued, bleeding cash from mismanagement and bloated contracts, like the one Roger had signed with his cousin's landscaping firm. Len's algorithm flagged it as a prime acquisition target. He'd been tracking similar companies for years, waiting for the right moment. This was it. He contacted his broker, a quiet man who handled Len's investments under strict confidentiality. "Put in a bid," Len said, his voice steady. "All of it." The board had no idea what was coming. They ignored the janitor, but Len was about to make himself impossible to overlook. The HOA boardroom was a temple of power, with its mahogany table, leather chairs, and a view of Crestwood's pristine golf course. Margaret presided like a queen, her agenda meticulously typed and distributed to the board. Today's topic, the sale of Pinnacle Properties. The private equity firm's offer was generous, $10 million, but Margaret wanted to negotiate for more. "We control the terms," she said, her eyes gleaming. "Pinnacle is our leverage." Roger leaned back, smirking. "Let's squeeze them. They're desperate for a foothold in this market." Sylvia nodded, already drafting a proposal for new surveillance tech to pitch to the buyer. Tom, ever the lawyer, suggested adding clauses to protect the board's influence post-sale. They debated for hours, oblivious to Len, who slipped in to refill their coffee. He moved silently, catching every word. Len's bid, submitted through a shell company, was $12 million. Cash, no contingencies. He'd spent years amassing the funds, leveraging his investments in tech stocks and real estate trusts. His broker had structured the deal to keep Len's name out of it, presenting the buyer as Crestwood Holdings. The board, eager for a quick sale, didn't dig too deep. They assumed it was another faceless corporation, not the man who scrubbed their floors. When the sale was finalized, Len didn't celebrate. He went to work, same as always, his coveralls pressed, his mop in hand. But he was no longer just the janitor. He owned Pinnacle Properties, which meant he controlled Crestwood's operations. Clubhouse, pool, landscaping, security, everything. The board didn't know it yet, but their invisible man was now their boss. The first sign of change came subtly. Len sent an email through Crestwood Holdings, requesting a meeting with the HOA board. Margaret, assuming it was routine, scheduled it for the following week. She didn't notice the new maintenance protocols Len had quietly implemented: eco-friendly cleaning supplies, a revised landscaping contract that cut Roger's cousin out, and a directive to prioritize resident feedback over board whims. Residents started noticing. Grass was greener, the pool sparkled, and the clubhouse felt warmer, more welcoming. At the meeting, Len walked in wearing his coveralls, carrying a folder of documents. Margaret frowned. "Leonard, this is a closed session. Clean later." Len smiled, a rare glint in his eyes. "I'm not here to clean," he said, placing the folder on the table. "I'm here as the owner of Pinnacle Properties." The room froze. Margaret's jaw tightened. Roger laughed, thinking it was a joke. Sylvia's eyes narrowed, scanning Len like he was a glitch in her code. Tom flipped through the documents, his face paling as he saw the signatures, the proof of ownership. "This is impossible," he stammered. Len sat down, his voice calm but firm. "It's done. I own Pinnacle, and I have some changes in mind for Crestwood." For the first time in 15 years, the board saw Leonard Carter, not the janitor, but the man who'd outmaneuvered them all. The rest of the chapter unfolds as Len begins asserting control, subtly at first. He audits Pinnacle's contracts, exposing Roger's shady deals and forcing him to resign from the board. Margaret, humiliated but unwilling to lose her grip, plots to undermine Len, rallying residents against the new management. Sylvia pushes for more surveillance, claiming it's for security, but Len counters with a community survey that reveals residents want transparency, not cameras. Tom, sensing the shift in power, tries to align with Len, but Len keeps him at arm's length, trusting only a few loyal maintenance workers who've known him for years. Len's changes are practical but revolutionary for Crestwood. Lower HOA fees by cutting wasteful spending, a community garden to replace an unused tennis court, and open forums where residents, not just the board, can vote on rules. Residents, once skeptical, start to rally behind the changes, especially when they see their dues drop without losing services. But Margaret's faction grows. painting Len as an outsider who's ruining Crestwood's prestige. They don't know he's been one of them all along, just unseen. The chapter ends with a tense HOA meeting where Margaret publicly challenges Len, accusing him of overstepping. Len, prepared, presents Pinnacle's financials showing how his reforms have saved $200,000 in 6 months. The residents applaud, but Margaret's eyes burn with defiance. She's not done fighting. Len, unfazed, sweeps the floor after the meeting, knowing the real battle is just beginning. Margaret Hensley wasn't used to losing. As Crestwood's HOA president for a decade, she'd built an empire of influence, her word law in every cul-de-sac. But Leonard Carter, the janitor-turned-owner, was dismantling her kingdom with infuriating calm. She sat in her home office, a glass of Pinot Grigio in hand, plotting her counterattack. Len's ownership of Pinnacle Properties was a shock, but Margaret saw it as a temporary setback. She'd dealt with upstarts before, residents who dared challenge her pet projects, like the $50,000 fountain she'd pushed through, despite budget concerns. They all folded eventually. Len would be no different. Her plan was simple: turn the residents against him. Crestwood's homeowners were predictable, status-obsessed, easily swayed by whispers of declining property values or threats to their exclusive lifestyle. Margaret called an emergency board meeting, excluding Len, and rallied her allies. Sylvia Chen, still stinging from Len's rejection of her surveillance plan, agreed to dig into his background. Roger Blaine, now off the board but still influential, promised to leverage his country club connections to smear Len. Tom Whitaker, ever the opportunist, played both sides, feigning loyalty to Margaret while slipping Len tidbits to stay in his good graces. Len, meanwhile, was transforming Crestwood from the ground up. He didn't sit in board meetings barking orders. He walked the neighborhood, talking to residents. Mrs. Alvarez, a widow who'd lived in Crestwood for 20 years, told him the pool hours were too restrictive for her grandkids. Len extended them. The Patels, a young couple, complained about the outdated playground. Len allocated funds for new equipment. He didn't flaunt his power, he listened, something the board had never done. Residents started calling him Mr. Carter, a title that made Margaret's blood boil. Len's reforms weren't just cosmetic. He hired a forensic accountant to dig into Pinnacle's books, uncovering years of inflated contracts and kickbacks. Roger's cousin's landscaping deal was just the tip of the iceberg. Margaret had funneled HOA funds into her own real estate ventures, disguised as consulting fees. Len didn't confront her directly. Instead, he sent the findings to Pinnacle's legal team, who drafted a report for the next HOA meeting. He wanted the residents to see the truth for themselves. Margaret's campaign gained traction. She hosted wine and cheese nights, spreading rumors that Len was a fraud, a nobody who'd somehow conned his way into power. She pointed to his coveralls, his modest apartment, as proof he didn't belong. Sylvia's research turned up Len's past, the corporate scandal, his fall from grace, but nothing illegal. Still, Margaret twisted it, whispering to residents that Len was a disgraced engineer with a vendetta. A petition circulated, demanding Pinnacle's sale be reversed. It gained 50 signatures, mostly from Margaret's social circle. But Len had allies too. The maintenance crew, Juan, Maria, and Old Man Pete, knew Len's worth. They'd seen him fix a broken sprinkler system at 2 a.m., heard him speak fluent Spanish to help Juan's son with a school project. They spread the word among residents. Len was one of them, not some corporate suit. Younger families, tired of Margaret's iron fist, started attending Len's open forums. The tide was turning, but slowly. The breaking point came at the annual Crestwood Gala, a black tie event at the clubhouse. Margaret had planned it as her stage, a chance to rally support and humiliate Len. She'd ensured he was invited, not as a guest, but as staff to clean up after. Len arrived in his coveralls carrying a broom, but he'd prepared a surprise. As Margaret gave her speech, praising Crestwood's legacy and subtly jabbing at outsiders, Len's team projected the forensic accountant's report on a screen behind her. Gasps filled the room as residents saw the numbers. $500,000 in misallocated funds, all tied to Margaret's ventures. Margaret's face went white. She tried to pivot, calling it a misunderstanding, but the residents weren't buying it. Len stepped forward, not to gloat, but to outline his vision, a Crestwood where every voice mattered, not just the boards. He announced a vote to amend the HOA bylaws, giving residents more power. The applause was deafening. Margaret stormed out, her allies trailing behind. The chapter closes with Len back in his apartment, reviewing the gala's success. He's won a battle, but Margaret's still a threat. She's meeting with a lawyer, planning to sue Pinnacle for breach of fiduciary duty. Len knows the war isn't over, but for the first time he feels Crestwood is his, not just as its owner, but as its heart. Leonard Carter stood at the edge of Crestwood's new community garden, watching kids plant sunflower seeds under Mrs. Alvarez's guidance. The garden, once a neglected tennis court, was now a symbol of his vision, a neighborhood that served its people, not its egos. 6 months had passed since the gala, and Crestwood was unrecognizable. HOA fees were down 20%, the clubhouse hosted free yoga classes, and the playground sparkled with new slides. Residents greeted Len by name, some even inviting him to barbecues, but victory was fragile. Margaret Hensley was still fighting, and her final move was coming. Margaret's lawsuit against Pinnacle had gained traction. She'd hired a top-tier law firm, claiming Len's acquisition was fraudulent and his reforms violated HOA bylaws. She'd rallied a small but vocal group of loyalists, older residents who feared change would tank their property values. Sylvia Chen, now Margaret's right hand, used her tech connections to launch a PR campaign, painting Len as a power-hungry outsider. Anonymous posts on X called him a janitor with a god complex. But Len had anticipated this. He'd hired his own legal team, using Pinnacle's profits to fund a defense that exposed Margaret's financial misdeeds in court. The residents were divided. Some, like the Patels, saw Len as a hero, organizing potlucks to support him. Others, swayed by Margaret's fear-mongering, demanded a return to the old ways. The tension peaked at a town hall where Margaret presented her case. Len's ownership was a hostile takeover, and his reforms were reckless. Len countered with data, charts showing improved services, higher resident satisfaction, and a 10% rise in property values since his changes. He didn't attack Margaret. He let the numbers speak. The vote to amend the bylaws passed, stripping the board of unilateral power. Margaret's lawsuit collapsed when her own financial records were subpoenaed, revealing offshore accounts tied to her consulting fees. She resigned from the board, sold her home, and left Crestwood in disgrace. Sylvia followed, moving to a tech hub upstate. Roger retreated to his country club, and Tom Whitaker, ever the survivor, became Len's reluctant ally, helping draft new bylaws. Len didn't rest on his laurels. He trained Juan and Maria for management roles at Pinnacle, ensuring Crestwood's future wasn't tied to one man. He funded scholarships for local kids, using Pinnacle's profits, and turned the clubhouse into a community hub with free Wi-Fi and job fairs. Residents started calling Crestwood the new model for HOAs, and other communities sent representatives to study Len's methods. The story ends with Len sweeping the community center's steps, his coveralls still his uniform, though now by choice. A young girl from the garden runs up, handing him a sunflower. "Thanks, Mr. Carter," she says. Len smiles, tucking the flower into his pocket. He's no longer invisible, not because he bought the company, but because he gave Crestwood a soul. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.